I can't, just nothing comes to mind right now, but we say it in church. Haven't you heard that in church a lot? Oh yeah, that's what he said. Well, I've always heard in church. Well, that's the problem. You should read the Bible instead of relying on what and don't rely on me either. You should look for yourself. That's why I like to put it up here. You know, make sure I'm telling you the truth here. If I don't expect you to take my word for anything, but I expect you to take what it says here seriously. What was I going to say? Oh, if it was up to you, see, if it was all about you and your obedience and your surrender, that sounds like the covenant he made with the nation of Israel, because with them it was up to their obedience, wasn't it? Yeah. If it were about that, then we don't need a mediator. We didn't need Jesus. We didn't need him to shed his blood. He could have just said, listen, folks, try just a little harder. You need to get some serious... No, see, all the trying a little harder wasn't going to cut it. He sent Jesus to be a mediator, and God made a perfect agreement. The new covenant is perfect, and it's infallible, and it can't fail because he didn't make it with fallible human beings like you and me. He made it with a perfect human being, Jesus, who's not fallible. And Jesus upholds the human side of it perfectly. So we who believe in him come under his lordship, and we become the beneficiaries of everything that he obtains through his own righteousness. Does that make sense? He lives a perfectly righteous life, whereas mine is flawed. Now, of course, we want to do the best we can, you know, and that's our nature. And we're going to come to that in just a minute. We don't live the life that we live because we're trying to get something from God. He says, well, we're coming to that in a minute. I'll say that. But we have a mediator. That's the first point I see. It's not a covenant between you and God. It's between God and Jesus. And our participation is because we put faith in the one that he has sent. That's why we're told all throughout the New Testament, again and again and again, to believe. Or in other words, to trust in or to rely on Jesus, because he's our mediator. He's the one who upholds the new covenant for us. So our part in this is to trust in him and to rely upon him. And I think what I spend most of my time doing is trying to convince people who profess to be Christians to actually believe in Jesus. Because what I find most Christians are doing, like that man that told me, it's all about my surrender, my obedience. You know what that means? That means you're not trusting Jesus, you're trusting in yourself. If you think it's about your obedience and your surrender, then you're relying on you and not Jesus. I hope that's not too hard to say it that way. What I try to do mostly is try to make Christians be Christians and trust in the mediator, trust in Jesus instead of in themselves. But I find this, that a lot of people will say, well, it's a little of both. It's him plus me. And I want to say, you know, I've had people tell me that. It's what I do, and then if I have anything lacking in my life, then he comes along and fills in whatever I lack. I want to say, who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? You know, make Jesus like a little janitor that comes and sweeps up afterwards. No. It's either him or you, but not both. It's either he makes us right with God through his death on the cross, or you by your obedience. But it's not both. And if you've got any flaws at all, what my recommendation is, you need to trust in Jesus as the Savior. Now, we do live a life that's based on that. We're coming to that. We'll get to that next. Okay, so the first thing I see in this passage that's important, that's new, is Jesus as a substitute, as a mediator, as an intercessor, the one that stands between. That's new. We didn't have that in the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant was between God and Israel. So he says in verse 8, finding fault with them. See, that's where the fault was, because it was between them and God. Behold, the days come. This is a quote from Jeremiah, by the way, if you want to know where the reference is. Jeremiah 31 is what chapter this is said. God speaking through Jeremiah says, behold, the days come in verse 8, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not according to the covenant. When he says not according to, he means not like or not based on. Not based on the covenant I made with their fathers. I wish I could convince, again, I say I'm trying to get Christians to be Christians and trust in a mediator. I wish I could convince Christians also that the new covenant is not like the old covenant. He says it right here, not according to. It's not the same thing. It's different. Not according to the covenant I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant. You see, that's what the flaw was. It was based on them. And I regarded them not. He was required to not regard them because of the terms of the agreement. Now, what are the terms of this new agreement? Verse 10. This is really interesting. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel in those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws not in a tablet of stone, externally, but in their mind, and write them in their hearts. And I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. Now, what does he mean when he says, I will write my law in their minds and in their hearts? Your mind and your heart are on the inside of you. Your mind is where you do your thinking, of course, as you know. Your heart is the most innermost part of your being, your essential inner core of yourself, of your identity. And he says, when he says, I will write my laws in their mind and on their hearts, he doesn't mean directions and commandments, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. He means his nature. You see, the reason that he wrote those commandments in tables of stone in those kind of ways, because it was external and they had to read them and look at them and try to live up to them. But we have something far more superior, far better and more superior in that we have a nature on the inside of us. It's not that he takes out a ballpoint pen and on the inside of us writes down specifically commandments, but we have in this new covenant, when we believe in Jesus, when we're trusting in him, he says here that he has written, and I prefer to say it this way, a new nature on the inside of us. Now, Paul uses the same language when he talks to Jews who didn't believe that Gentiles could be saved. And he says, listen, if Gentiles who don't even have the law, if they do by nature the things contained in the law, they become a law to themselves. Paul's saying Gentiles don't have all these commandments. They maybe don't even, back in those days especially, they didn't have printed Bibles like we have. And these Gentiles were getting saved by trusting in Jesus, and Jews were coming along and saying, well, they can't be saved. They don't know all the laws. They don't know all the rules. And Paul didn't give them to them either. He didn't hand out copies of the Old Testament because he said they are doing by nature. Well, how could they do by nature the things that are written there? Because God says, he said, this is the terms of the covenant. I'll put my laws in your mind and in your heart. He puts into us a nature that's different, a nature that's new. He puts his spirit on the inside of us. So we have something far superior. We are compelled and directed and motivated, that's a better word, motivated by what's on the inside. It exerts a pressure from the inside to follow and do the will of God. Another reference I'll refer you to is in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, when he says, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may know the good and the perfect and acceptable will of God. I like what the Amplified there says, that you can know exactly what God's will for you personally is. And that brings me to the next point. Well, I don't want to move yet. Sometimes people are so attached to the Old Testament law and the Ten Commandments and the old system. People are so attached to that this, I find people kind of, well, you know, I'll just give them the benefit of the doubt. Cause a lot of questions, because just like that guy told me, well, I've always been raised in church. I've heard this. Well, we hear things, you know, growing up, and this kind of goes in a different direction. But listen, think about it this way. Which is better? A commandment that says, thou shalt not steal, or a nature on the inside that not only compels me not to steal from you, but to give you what I have? Which you think's better? Well, the nature on the inside is better. And not only do I not need, see, this is what a person, and I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, say, well, what are you trying to say? That we don't need the commandment to say, thou shalt not murder? I said, well, do you need God to come and write that down and tell you not to murder? Don't you have a new nature on the inside? You see, a Christian doesn't need a commandment, thou shalt not murder. Because not only will I not murder you, I'm likely to lay down my life for you. Because of the love of God, because of the new nature. Not only will I not steal from you, I'll give you what I have. That's the new nature. That's the nature that he's talking about, written in our hearts and in our minds. And by the way, the fact that he even gave them commandments on the outside in the Old Testament in a subtle way points out the fact that they had a nature that was contrary. And so all of those commandments, in fact, Paul tells it this way, it's a very subtle and a very peculiar thing. He says the law is the strength of sin, Paul says. That's what he says. He says the law is the strength of sin. And then in another place in Romans chapter 5, he says the law was given that transgression might abound. It's like what is the word? When you put a chemical in and it draws something to the surface. There's a word for that. I can't think what is that? What is that? You know. Well, anyway.
Catalyst?
Catalyst. That's right. The law is a catalyst, and it brings sin to the surface so you can recognize it and then trust him to say that's its purpose. So